There are moments when a conversation feels less like an interview and more like a quiet earthquake. Not because voices are raised, or gestures are dramatic, but because every word carries the weight of something ancient, something sacred, something nearly forgotten. That is what happened when Cardinal Gerhard Müller sat across from Bishop Robert Barron in that serene American studio. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. The lights were soft, the air calm, the tone academic, but underneath it all was something deeper, something that felt like a tremor in the foundations of the Church's soul. It was gentle, solemn, respectful, yet it reverberated beneath the surface like holy tension. Something was about to be said, not just interesting, but essential. Not merely insightful, but existential. Bishop Barron introduced Cardinal Müller with sincerity, honoring his brilliance and his past role as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a position that does not simply demand knowledge, but guardianship. He was not merely a scholar. He was a custodian of clarity, of certainty, of truth. Yet the moment the first question was asked, it was clear this would not be a polite exchange of intellectual theories. Müller did not speak like a professor displaying knowledge, he spoke like a witness recalling reality. His words were not ornamental, they were surgical. They did not entertain, they confronted. The conversation began with Karl Rahner, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century. Barron approached the subject with admiration, noting Rahner's attempt to reconcile traditional theology with modern philosophy. But Müller did not dwell on academic admiration. He spoke instead of a silent danger, a danger that emerges not from loud rejection of God, but from subtle distortion. When theology surrenders mystery to abstraction, when faith dissolves into ideas, we no longer encounter Christ, we invent him. That sentence shifted the atmosphere. The interview was no longer about theology as scholarship. It was about theology as encounter. It was no longer about theories, it was about the person at the heart of Christianity. Müller explained that when human experience becomes the center of theology, revelation begins to bend. Not visibly at first, not aggressively, but quietly. Doctrine becomes interpretation, truth becomes preference, and faith becomes personal narrative. Christ becomes a projection, a concept shaped by feelings and culture, rather than a living person to be adored. When the modern subject becomes the center, the Incarnation becomes metaphor, the resurrection becomes symbolism, and sacraments become rituals of memory rather than encounters with divine reality. He paused, then said something that seemed to cut through centuries of theological confusion: God did not become an idea. He became flesh. Those words felt like the moment when you realize that Christianity does not just tell us something, Christianity shows us someone. Faith is not merely believing that something is true, but encountering that someone is real. His presence, his body, his voice, his wounds. And that is what Cardinal Müller insisted had been quietly slipping away, not faith itself, but the sense of its reality. He then spoke of what he called a pervasive, modern form of Gnosticism, not the ancient version that rejected the physical world, but a contemporary one that reduces faith to internal feeling, where experience becomes supreme, and the body becomes irrelevant. A faith without incarnation. A spirituality without reality. A religion without worship. He did not shout or condemn. He spoke like a surgeon, naming something hidden beneath symptoms. Gender ideology, he said gently, not with anger but with clarity, is a form of modern Gnosticism. It rejects the body as God's gift. It insists that personal feeling defines reality, rather than creation revealing truth. The body, he explained, is not a canvas for identity, it is part of revelation. The body is language. It speaks of origin, purpose, and destiny. God did not redeem souls. He redeemed persons, body and soul. Suddenly, the interview no longer felt academic. It felt deeply human. It felt like a return, not to theory, but to Christ himself. That is why Müller then declared, almost prayerfully, the Incarnation is not a metaphor. The resurrection is not a symbol. The Eucharist is not a memory. He paused. These are realities, or our faith is a fairy tale. Silence followed. Not empty silence, reverent silence. He spoke of Rudolf Bultmann, whose theory suggested that the resurrection was not a real, physical event, but a mystical awakening in the minds of the disciples. Müller's tone was quiet, yet firm. The empty tomb was not a metaphor. The apostles did not face lions, swords, stones, prison, slander, exile, and martyrdom for poetry. They did not die for inspiration, they died because they encountered someone. Someone who had died. Someone who had risen. Someone who was alive. They saw him. They touched him. They ate with him. They heard his voice. Christianity did not survive because it was meaningful. It survived because it was true. Because he lives. At that moment, the interview stopped being a theological event and became a spiritual one. The air felt different, as though something ancient had just re-entered the room. Then Barron asked about Europe, the continent that once sent missionaries across the globe, built grand cathedrals, produced saints and scholars, but now struggles to fill its churches. Müller did not speak politically or culturally. He spoke pastorally, almost sorrowfully. Europe is losing its soul, he said. Not because others take it, but because we have stopped guarding it. The issue was not secularism. It was surrender. Not to governments or ideologies, but to forgetfulness. To forgetting who the Church once adored. That became the turning point of the entire conversation. Because suddenly, Müller was no longer warning about error, he was calling for renewal. A renewal not of structures, not of strategies, but of worship. Bishop Barron asked, so how do we renew the faith? Through better teaching? Better evangelization? Better communication? But Müller answered with a single word. Not innovation. Not management. Not debate. Worship. Christianity does not grow through strategy. It grows through adoration. Every renewal in church history, from Francis of Assisi to Teresa of Avila, from Benedict to Catherine of Siena, began not with paperwork, not with debate, but with worship. With hearts dropped to their knees. With silence before the presence. With Eucharistic amazement. Not long after, Müller delivered one of the most striking lines of the entire interview: the crisis of Christianity is not a crisis of faith. It is a crisis of worship. When worship fades, belief follows. When adoration disappears, truth becomes distant. When the Eucharist becomes symbolic, Christianity becomes sentimental. When Christ ceases to be adored, he slowly becomes optional, negotiable, replaceable. And when he is not worshipped, something else will be. For as Müller gently warned, man is always kneeling. The only question is, before whom? It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis. A spiritual one. When the church stops worshipping, she starts managing. When she stops adoring, she starts strategizing. When she stops kneeling, she starts talking. And strangely, she talks more and believes less. She plans more, but transforms less. She becomes busy, but not holy. Noisy, but not radiant. Then Barron, visibly moved, asked, then what would you say to those Catholics, priests, teachers, families, young people, who feel discouraged? Who feel as though the church they love is changing into something unfamiliar? Cardinal Müller did not respond with instructions, but with compassion. "I too have felt their pain," he said softly. "But remember, Christ has not abandoned his church. He cannot. She is not just an institution. She is his bride." He paused, then added, "When you feel confusion, do not cling to commentary. Cling to Christ. Return, not to arguments, but to the altar. Return to the tabernacle. Return to the wounds in his hands." In that moment, the interview felt less like a conversation and more like prayer. Like a quiet invitation to return not just intellectually, but spiritually, emotionally, liturgically, physically. To kneel. He reminded Barron that the Church has faced worse. Heresies, schisms, corruption, wars, internal collapses. Yet the Church was never restored by argument alone. She was restored by saints. Saints who were not merely brilliant, but holy. Saints who did not just speak truth, but knelt before truth. Saints who did not simply defend the Eucharist, but adored it. When the Church adores, he said, she becomes young again. When she kneels, she stands again. When she listens to his voice, she stops echoing the world. The answer was not to modernize the gospel. The answer was to let the gospel modernize us. Not to adjust Christ to culture, but to allow Christ to adjust us to himself. And there it was, the hidden heart of Catholicism. It is not merely a philosophy about God. It is a revelation of God entering history. Not spirituality rising upward, but divinity descending downward. Christianity is not humanity reaching toward heaven. It is heaven reaching toward us. Which is why Müller ended with one of the most hauntingly beautiful sentences spoken in any interview: Christianity is not a path we climb toward God. It is a descent, God coming toward us. If we do not kneel, we will miss him. Silence filled the space, not the silence of uncertainty, but of reverence. The kind of silence that does not ask for more information, because it has received an invitation. Not to think deeper, but to kneel lower. Not to discuss more, but to adore more. Because in the end, the conversation did not explain the Church. It remembered her. It did not strategize renewal, it witnessed where renewal begins. Not at conferences. Not in debates. But at the altar. Where he waits. Where everything began. Where everything returns. Where everything is real. Christ, here. Or nothing matters. If this message touched your heart, comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.